and probably it's now the time for me to take over. And yeah, also say hi. I'm Patrick, and I have the pleasure today to introduce Maria-Therese Friehs to you. So we go way back when Therese actually did her bachelor studies at the University of Marburg. And that's the time that we met first when she was an RA in the social psych group, back then headed by Uli Wagner. And I'd like to think that this kind of already foreshadowed the project that she's going to present on today, because she then also went on to actually write her bachelor thesis with me. Back then, or still in the German system, that's something that you can do. You can already supervise bachelor thesis as a PhD student. And Therese actually wrote her thesis about a longitudinal intergroup contact study. And funny anecdote, actually, the way that we analyzed it was probably not state of the art, but it's funny to now look back at these things and think, oh yeah, we've lived and learned. After bachelor studies, she stayed in Marburg to do then also her master's thesis, and then, bless her, decided to do again another thesis with me, against her better judgment, I believe. Afterwards, she continued her studies at the University of Osnabrück, and then did her PhD at the University of Landau, and ever since has then actually worked at the Department of Methodology at the University of FernUniversität Hagen, together with Olli. And I think it's a great match because also the way that I would characterize Therese's research interests are indeed at this nexus of methodology and integral contact. And probably this is something that's going to shine through also in today's talk. So without much further ado, we are all looking very much forward to your talk, Therese. And yeah, I think you promised us about 40 minutes, and we're looking forward to that.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you for introducing me. So lovely. I will just let me try again. So hopefully now you see my slides, right?
Yes, all good.
Yes, lovely. Okay, then let's start. Funnily enough, the just mentioned bachelor thesis was a longitudinal data analysis of intergroup contact with null effects. And maybe this somehow, was prophetic for a lot of work which I did since my bachelor thesis. And this is also a little bit the topic I would like to present today or discuss a little bit today. I'm talking about longitudinal intergroup contact effects in naturalistic settings, what we know and where to go from here. And I think longitudinal effects are one of the hot topics in our field at the moment. There are so many new publications which just have come out like the last week or like the last month. So the field is really growing and the findings are quite challenging. So therefore, I'm trying to summarize these findings, and I'm also going to present new data that we have been working on. And unfortunately, I can already forecast that this will be the depressive part of my presentation, but then I'll also invite you to think a little bit more about what these data mean and how we might be able to explain them and what this might mean for the future. And I hope that this is maybe a little more optimistic. And before I start, just again, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a special honor to be starting this lecture series, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation and to the discussion afterwards. And I'll try to be a little quicker than the 40 minutes, so we'll have time for this discussion. So you all know the contact hypothesis, so I will not introduce this again, but just saying, like, looking at the field, we have a lot of meta-analytic evidence that contact works, but this research in the meta-analysis is mostly cross-sectional or correlational, and causal evidence usually comes from lab experiments with quite limited external validity, which led Betsy Pollock and colleagues to conclude that there's actually not enough causal evidence at the moment to inform policymakers about the effectiveness of intergroup contact. And when looking at causal effects of contact, we can not only look at lab experiments or contact interventions in controlled or natural settings, we can also look at longitudinal data. And they are highly relevant for us because under some conditions, they can be interpreted causally in terms of Granger causality, because we know that the predictor precedes the outcome, so contact comes before the change in attitudes. And also when experimental or quasi-experimental research is unfeasible, or actually when really studying naturalistic processes and we want to go to the field. So longitudinal data is important to our field and has been growing over the last 20 years, I'd say. And often if we look at longitudinal effects, we're looking at cross-legged effects of contact on attitudes. I'm sorry, now we start the methods part that Patrick promised. So we want to know if having intergroup contact at time 1 would affect my attitudes towards the outgroup at time 2. And rather than just looking at this regression coefficient or correlation, we best also introduce the outgroup attitudes at time 1 to not only look at the level of contact at time 2, but this change in attitudes between time 1 and time 2. And we might also introduce the stability of intergroup contact. And if we do this, we end up with a classical cross-legged panel model, where we can have a look at both stability of intergroup contact over time and the cross-legged effects from contact to attitudes and from attitudes to contact, also looking at the directionality of effects. However, these cross-legged panel models have been criticized for a number of reasons, most of them having to do with not really estimating the causal effect properly because they do not include covariates or confounding variables. And one very prominent recent critique has been that they don't consider the multi-level structure of longitudinal data. So in longitudinal data, we measure the same people again and again. So people are time points are nested within participants, this is it. And therefore we have between person effects and within person effects, as we know from the usual multi-level literature. A between person effect, I try to depict this one here. If we look at 3 measurement points and we look at 4 people, then people in their rank order might more or less stay the same, or they might change, but you can still make some general claims over all these 3 time points. For example, compared to the dark purple person, the light gray person reports high levels of contact across all these time points. And compared to that, we are also looking at within person effects. So for example, we just look at this purple person and we see that they tick a different answer box on our item at the 3 time points, and therefore we can say that compared to time 1, this dark purple person reports higher levels of contact at time 3. So this would be an intra-individual change as compared to a rank order effect. So we can now extend our cross-legged panel model, if we have at least 3 waves of data, to include these multi-level effects. And this is now called the random intercept cross-legged panel model. Rather than, so if we use these boxes as observed data, we don't model the cross-legged effects and the stability effects directly, but we separate our observed variables into random intercepts, that is between person effects. You might know them from growth curves. So this is the stable rank order across all measurement points. We have one stable or random intercept for contact, we have one for attitudes, and we can correlate both of them. And then we separate, and these factors are not correlated, so it's either between person variance or within person variance. The rest of the variance, which is not stable, into a between person factor, and then we can just model the cross-legged effects on these within person factors. And these are now somewhat more difficult to interpret because this is now about changes from your average or from the individual mean. And for example, the cross-legged effects of contact on attitudes would be that if a person has more than average contact at time 1, they would most likely have more positive than average attitudes at time 2. We're now really talking about their means and fluctuations or deviations from their means, making this model quite dynamic. And this model allows us to separate between person effects, which are stable over time, from these within person fluctuations. And we can also assume that these stable between person differences might reflect stable covariates. So the random intercepts of contact and attitudes might, for example, be predicted by our levels of right-wing authoritarianism or social dominance orientation or demographic variables. And therefore, introducing these stable between person differences helps us control for confounders. So we know a lot about how contact data perform in random intercept cross-legged panel models. And there's some published works on contact and attitudes, but also contact on perceived discrimination, collective action, and social cohesion as dependent variables. And I've brought and tried to summarize them very shortly here. And I'm really, really happy to see that so many of the authors of these papers are here today. So I hope we can enter a lovely discussion later. And we see basically that we have a number of studies which are usually quite highly powered. And just looking at within person effects and between person effects, basically they all find significant between person effects as according to theory. So the between person factor of contact positively correlates with the between person factor of attitudes. But all in all, there's very, very negligible evidence for within person effects. So having a deviation in contact from my average usually doesn't predict having a deviation from my attitudes at a later time point. There is also work from Fiona Barlow, who did not do random intercept cross-legged panel models, but a familiar model, which is auto-regressive latent trajectory models. And they partly found evidence for within-person effects in about 1/5 of all cases. And there's also other research using other analytical models, which can look at within-person effects, but I did not bring them today, just for clarity. There's more data, and this is now the new data. So together with Sarina, Ollie, and a lot of other co-workers, I'm at the moment doing a reanalysis of all published contact longitudinal data sets, which we could get our hands on, basically. So we're now looking at 31 data sets from 21 publications and an N of about 33,000 participants. And we're running comparative analysis using cross-legged panel model, full forward cross-legged panel model, and random intercept cross-legged panel model to see how applying different methods also affects the results. Just for clarification, a full forward cross-legged panel model is another recent alternative to the traditional cross-legged panel model introduced by Lütke and Robic. And they propose that if you not only have the time 1 leg effect, but also the higher legged effect. So if you have 3 measurement waves, you would introduce the effects from time 1 to time 3. If you have 4 waves, you would also introduce from time 1 to time 4 and all in between. Then you better control for stable confounders over time, because if there is any kind of confounder that already affected the measurement of time 1, then this effect would be controlled for in time 3. And they propose to run these models, which are fully identified, so we cannot really gather information about model fit from these models, and only look at the very, very last measurement interval, because this is most controlled for confounding variables, and look at whether there is a cross-legged effect there. So in this case, we would look at contact time 2 affecting attitudes time 3 in the example I have above. So we did this for all these data, and we looked both for the cross-leg panel model and the random intercept cross-leg panel model if we could introduce stationarity to simplify our models. And I'm now summarizing the findings we have. Looking at model fit, as I said, there is no model fit information in the full forward cross-leg panel model because it's fully identified. But for the cross-leg panel model, we could usually find that the model fit was not adequate or just partially adequate according to our model fit criteria, while for the random intercept cross-leg panel model, it was a good fit to the data in all or almost all of our cases. If we look at the contact effects, so looking at the share of cross-legged contact attitudes effect in accordance with theory or not in accordance with theory, we find that in the cross-leg panel model, in about, depending on the stationarity assumptions, 40 to 67%, we find significant cross-legged effects from contact on attitudes in accordance with theory. And we also find them in about 30% of the full forward cross-legged panel model data, and we find them in a substantially less, so 11 to 14% in the within person part of the random intercept cross-legged panel model. So these effects don't replicate. There is no real difference in terms of the number of effects which are not in accordance with theory, and being the more complex model, there's a slightly increased number of implausible parameter estimates for the random intercept cross-leg panel model, so there are some technical issues when estimating those models. And finally, if we have a look at the between person effect for the random intercept cross-leg panel model, we see that we can confirm or support what we've also found in the published literature, that very, very often the between person contact attitudes correlation are significant and in accordance with theory. And that the random intercept cross-leg panel model is actually fitting the data much better than the cross-leg panel model in all cases. So this analysis basically confirms what we've seen in the literature in some cases where cross-leg panel models and random intercept cross-leg panel models have been compared, that random intercept cross-leg panel models seem to be a bit better fit to the data, but they usually don't produce within person cross-legged effects, while cross-leg panel models usually do. And we can also support this claim in a meta-analysis, a mini meta-analysis using all the effects we reanalyzed. Having a look first at so separating for positive contact effects and negative contact effects. Looking first at the cross-leg panel model, we actually find significant effects in all cases. So if we use cross-legged panel models, we'd usually find a cross-legged contact effect, both for positive contact and for negative contact. Using the full forward cross-leg panel model, which is better able to control for confounders, we see that we usually don't find significant effects in the meta-analysis, although for the negative intergroup contact, the effect seems to be somewhat stronger than for the positive contact. And lastly, for the random intercept cross-leg panel model, the between-person associations are significant in all cases, while the within-person cross-legged effects are not significant in any of the 4 cases. There is also more non-published data which I'd like to present, and this is a work of Alex O'Donnell's, which we recently submitted for publication. And what we did there, or what he did, so he did all the data analysis and all the work basically, is that we ran latent class growth analyses across 14 samples and more than 22,000 participants, including NZAVS, New Zealand Attitudes and Values Survey, GESIS, so this is a German representative survey, and SILS for EU data. latent class growth analyses are somewhat different from the random intercept cross-leg panel model, because what they do is they look at the trajectory, so the mean values of contact and attitudes, and they look at how these mean values change over time. And then we have one trajectory for the entire sample. And then the latent class growth analysis looks at unobserved heterogeneity, so latent classes of people who have different kinds of trajectories in contact and in attitudes. And our idea was that we might use this approach to find maybe even a sub-sample of people who would show the classical pattern we would expect in accordance with contact theory. So people increasing in contact over time and subsequently or in parallel also increasing in attitudes. And so now I present the data to you. We have a different number of latent classes in the different samples. So the solid lines you see always represent the contact levels, and the dotted lines the intergroup attitudes for the specific group. And there are many really interesting patterns in there, but what we very, very rarely see is substantial increase in contact and co-occurring increase in attitudes. For study 2, this looks about similar. There's actually nothing going on really in terms of change. For study 3, the same, and also for study 4. So basically, to conclude, what we can say about the state of the field at the moment is that longitudinal contact effects based on a cross-leg panel model disappear once we introduce more control for confounders by using more advanced analytical models, such as the full forward or the random intercept cross-leg panel model. There's only negligible evidence that there's within-person intergroup contact effects on outgroup attitudes or other dependent variables we've looked at in naturalistic longitudinal contact data. And also the trajectories of contact and attitudes don't show evidence for groups of people, or that groups of people exist where which experience an increase in contact and a subsequent increase in attitudes in naturalistic settings. So this was a little bit the depressive part. I find this very depressive because this really conflicts with a lot of things we thought we knew and we assumed by literature. And this is also what has been discussed in the papers. I've only taken some abstracts from the different discussions, and the findings have been discussed, for example, as evidence that contact effects which we have found in previous analyses might have been interpreted as within-person effects in line with the contact hypothesis without necessarily representing intra-individual change. So we've been assuming too much on an intra-individual level, that the data call into question the ideas put forth by many that spending more time with or befriending outgroup members causes people to be more politically supportive of them, and therefore reinforcing long-standing doubts of whether contact can promote social change, or that contact effects are better or even only empirically supported with regards to differences between people, and not with regards to change within people over time. So these findings may be incongruent with mainstream thinking about contact as a process capable of changing intergroup outcomes over time. However, so I think there's definitely truth to these words and a huge need for caution, but I also think that there might be some things we have overlooked, especially with the data we have been analyzing so far. And this is what I'd like to focus on now. So some additional ideas, apart from what has been put forth in the literature, how we might explain these findings, and also some ideas and notions worth of discussion. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about these. And my first proposal would be that most of the data, or a large majority of the data, are actually unsuitable to test intergroup contact theory predictions on a within-person level. And this is, first of all, because mostly we observe extremely low levels of intergroup contact. I've had a look at the published literature, which I showed you in the table, and the data either I provided or which were freely available, and I reanalyzed these data. So this is the data of Gorska and Tausch, the data of Hodson and Milady, and the data of Friehs et al. 2024, and had a look at the distributions of our variables, and having a look at the frequency of outgroup friends or intergroup contact. For instance, you see that these data are extremely skewed towards not having contact at all. So if we assume this variable to be, normally distributed, this would definitely not be supported by our data. In the contact, so there's one data set which deviates a little bit from this, and this is the one you see here on the left, which is the first study of the Friehs et al. 2024 paper, and the self-reported contact, but we're asking school students who are actually sharing a classroom, which is, or school students in a classroom which is constituted about 50-50 of different ethnicities, so white British or Asian British students, so that they have high levels of intergroup contact, is not really surprising in this context, but in all other contexts that we've observed, we usually find very, very low levels of contact. So also in the different other variables. A positive contact in the Gorska and Tausch data that was a little bit higher. Not only is there very little contact, but it also remains highly stable over time. I only brought the contact data, but attitudes actually look quite similar. So if we look at the change that people report from one measurement wave to the other, then we see, I'm sorry, the scale is a little bit skewed here. We see that most people report no change at all over time. And this is literally the same for all data sets that we looked at. So there's just not much going on in terms of contact experiences over time. We also usually look at very long or quite long time intervals. So the NZAVS data, which have been used a couple of times, have a measurement interval of 1 year, and so does the SILS data. The GESIS data has 6 months, and apart from the Gorska and Tausch publication, which has an interval of 2 weeks, and the Schulman publication, which looks at different time intervals of a day, a week, and a month, most of them are 2 or more months. And this is, of course, challenging if we look at these within-person effects from this logic that having a deviation in my average of contact causes a deviation in my attitudes at a later time point, because for this logic, we need to know how quickly contact affects attitudes, and have a multiple months as an interval in between does not really seem very likely. And also, most of the data we looked at uses adult samples. And we know from other research that adult samples usually are very stable in their contact experiences, and we cannot really assume a lot of change in attitudes or contact to happen in adult samples. There are 2 exceptions which I could find, and this is the first study of Friehs et al., who looked at school students, and also the data of McKean et al. Looking at adolescents. The second point is that we're actually not really considering time and temporal dynamics in our theory of intergroup contact. So as I just mentioned, how long does it take for one contact experience to affect attitudes? Does it change my first impression of a person? So it's this thing about seconds, or is it a cumulative experience of multiple positive interactions building up into one change of attitudes over time, which can take weeks or months? The theory is not really clear here, and I think this is where we need to start our work. If we have different measures of contact and definitely also different measures of attitudes, especially of attitudes, are the differences in how quickly they would react. So is our change to a contact experience more quickly on a warmth scale, for example, than on an intergroup anxiety scale? We don't really know much about that. And we also don't know much about how the measurement periods, the time intervals, the number of measurement waves, and the time frames in the measurements affect longitudinal intergroup contact effects. So there's a lot of methods, effects that we don't really know about. And there's this lovely figure in a recent article by Ellen Hamaker, which discusses time in psychological theories a lot. And she proposes that we can think about processes in psychological science, such as contact, on a micro level where we have moment-to-moment or day-to-day changes, the typical diary or experience sampling study. But then these would fuel just one measurement. So the entire data collection might just fuel one measurement point on a meso level, which would be a weekly or a monthly measurement, and which again might just fuel the macro level on a year-to-year level. And this might affect also finding stability at one level, which we cannot reproduce on another level, etc., etc. So I found this graph very helpful to start thinking about what kind of process do we want to look at, and how might these processes accumulate to affect the processes we might measure on a different level. We can also start thinking about trait and state-like aspects of contact. So one very nice side effect, I think, of the randomized cross-like panel model is that this introduction of within and between person effects quite reflects the idea of trait and state-like aspects we have from personality psychology. And maybe we should think more about traits like predictors of contact and attitudes, and how we can understand contact as being very, very stable and a between person difference over a long time, and how this is explained and can be changed or affected. And we also know or it's already been proposed, that contact is not really linear across the lifespan. We have this beautiful model about the asymptotic intergroup contact effect by McInnes and Page-Gould, assuming that our very first interaction with an outgroup member has a much stronger effect on our attitudes than, let's say, the 20th interaction, because at some point the effect just levels off. And so therefore, if this model holds true, we actually have to go back to the initial process and the very first interactions, because if we look at a stable process, then all we get is this stable line you see in the lower part of the graph. Also, I think intergroup contact theory needs to be put more into context. So if we think back about how the original intergroup contact hypothesis and the theory and the literature that was used to propose this hypothesis, what was investigated there, then most of the very early research comes from strongly segregated settings, such as the United States, with a strong segregation of white and black US Americans. And most research investigated intergroup contact or changes in intergroup contact in a very meaningful and substantial context. So they looked at housing projects, mixed housing projects versus non-mixed housing projects. They also looked at the army, where white and black platoons were put together, etc., etc. And this is a very, very substantial. So having this contact is very relevant for the people, and it's not only one everyday interaction we're looking at, but a very substantial change for these people. And another thing is that we might think more about the kind of contact experience we're investigating. So Deborah Schulman and colleagues recently proposed that we can have, that there are different contact effects. There is this time-by-time fluctuation. So these everyday contacts, I'm meeting a person or may not be meeting a person, which lead to very, very low-level changes. There might be major events such as me moving house or starting my university studies, and therefore being in a much more diverse context than I used to be. And then we can have a look at the cumulative effect over time of all these experiences. And I think we should focus more and be more explicit about what kind of contact effects we're looking at in our research. And the last thing is that maybe the effects I've just presented and we've recently published are not really the effects we are looking for. I recently met Patrick at a conference, and he asked me, so what do we actually need the random intercept cross-sect panel model for in contact research? And first of all, I thought this was a strange question, but the more I thought about it, I think the more truth there was to it, because the random intercept, we're focusing a lot on the random intercept cross-sect panel model at the moment, but there are also weaknesses to this model, and one of them being that the interpretation of these within-person cross-sect effects is quite challenging and maybe also not really what we want to have. Having a fluctuation from your mean at one time affecting the fluctuation of the mean at another time, while overall this of course needs to be stable, is a very difficult interpretation and maybe not really what we're looking or what we want to look at in contact research in terms of aligning the statistical estimate or parameter we look at with how we understand the effect in the natural setting. Also, if I just mentioned that there's usually a lot of, also in other research, there is a lot of more substantial changes in contact. So if we want to have more changes in contact, then the cross-sect panel model would not really be helpful, because if I have a pre-post follow-up design, for example, with a contact intervention, a natural or an experimentally induced intervention, then my pre-contact levels cannot possibly predict my post-contact attitudes effects, right? So having cross-sect effects in there would not really be helpful for all the kind of data where we assume a lot of change to happen over time. We rather need to look at mean value changes, so trajectories such as latent change scores or latent growth curve models. And last of all, also the question, so what is the role of between-person effects? There's been some research looking at whether the correlation between contact and attitudes on a between-person level disappears if we control for stable between-person differences such as personality and intergroup ideologies, or what might possibly predict these between-person factors. And I think there's still more research we can do on that. So what can we do now in future research? I think one thing which is very, very important, which I've not really touched upon as yet, is working on the measurement of contact and attitudes. And I'm really, really happy that at the Hamburg meeting, there was a group which focused on that and which has already become very active in working on measurement of contact, because as in most areas of social psychology, our measurement instruments of contact and attitudes are usually not validated, and we use different measurements in different surveys, making it very difficult to compare over time or between studies. Oftentimes, the definition of what a contact means and what intergroup means is left to the participants. This is not really clear from the instructions. There are we know from research that many interactions that lay people define as intergroup contact are not really effectual to attitude change because they're just too low level. And usually also measurements do not include any temporal reference, which is important for intergroup for longitudinal research. So rather than we usually just ask how much contact do you have, we don't ask how many contact have you had in the last 2 weeks. But this might be really important if we have a bi-weekly or monthly or whatever measurement, because we don't want to aggregate the contact experiences from the previous wave into the recent actual measurement. And so therefore, temporal references both for the contact and the attitudes might be very helpful. We can also look at how the longitudinal effects of contact change depending on the outcome. So all the different conceptualizations we have of outgroup attitudes and related constructs, but also on the contact valence, the intensity of the contact, and the direct or indirect form of intergroup contact. So our reanalysis shows us a little bit about positive and negative contact and friendship versus just experienced contact, and so does the published literature at some point, but I think there's still much more we can do. We can also look at methodological aspects, which I've already mentioned. So how many measurement waves are suitable, what should be the measurement interval or the interval between the measurements, what should be the time frame of the measurement instrument, and what is an adequate analytical model to analyze these data in the end. There's much more work we can do on in this area. And last of all, I think it's if we really want to know how contact affects attitudes in naturalistic settings, then we need to look at contexts where there is substantial and meaningful change in contact. So where there is the opportunity for contact to actually change our dependent variables. And this might be contexts where there is a change in contact, or where there's initial contact experiences. So looking at shocks to our social network, maybe moving house, going to university, going abroad, obligatory military service, retirement, etc. So there are these instances in life where our surrounding just changes, and they might be interesting opportunities to do research. And if we do, we need to have a sufficient resolution in terms of measurement, waves, and intervals to detect these processes in detail. So if contact affects attitudes in a matter of minutes, a half-a-year interval between two measurements does not really help us to describe this process. And therefore, we need adequate study designs and analytical models. So then now, doing a very short summary, because I am already talking longer than I wanted to. Applications of recent advanced analytical models have strongly questioned our beliefs that intergroup contact works in the wild longitudinally. And longitudinal contact effects are mostly explained by between-person differences, with negligible evidence for within-person effects. But these findings rely on data which might not be very suitable to show strong within-person intergroup contact effects. And therefore, we first of all need to work on our theory about time in intergroup contact, and also conduct longitudinal studies under more optimal conditions with suitable designs and methodology to detect longitudinal intergroup contact effects. And with that, I thank all my wonderful collaborators on the different projects on longitudinal data that I've been involved in the last couple of years. And I also thank you very much for staying with me and listening to me. And I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I wish you a lovely weekend already. So, thank you.